Good evening, witches, warlocks, sorcerers, adepts, friends, fans, family, and followers to Season 3, Episode 9 of the hit underground radio occult show known as Knights of the Nephilim, brought to you by Celestial Oddities Radio and the Coterie of Samil Arcane Occult Order. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in throughout this season. If you've missed any of our episodes, please feel free to jump back at any point in time and catch any of our past guests. But make sure you stick around throughout this episode, as we have one that I've been very highly anticipating, I should say. Before we jump into tonight's guest, as always, you can click the like, share, and follow button on whatever platform you're tuning in from, whether it be iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Deezer, Spreaker, CastBox, Google, Amazon, Instagram, Facebook, you name it. We are on it, and listen where you feel comfortable, but by clicking those buttons, it moves us up the podcast community rankings, allows more people to discover the show, keeps you in the loop with new episodes as they air, and gives you unfiltered access to our past archives, not only of this show, Knights of the Nephilim, which is based upon esoteric science, occult doctrine, and ritual magic, bringing on the biggest and best names in occultism from authors and practitioners, ritual toolmakers, mystics, and theologians, to one of our other shows, maybe like Celestial Oddities Pair of Normal Guys podcast, based and centered on paranormal and supernatural phenomena, deep diving into content and subject matter pertaining to those items, interviewing professionals within that field, and also doing our special episodes called Odd World, where we take on phone calls from people just like you from around the world to hear your strange and extraordinary stories of the unexplained. Or it be our retired show that's called Uncovering the Underground, where there's almost 100 episodes of interviews of music to modeling, stars of the big screen, comedy, oddities, and everything in between. We are always aiming to give you thought-provoking and mind-expansive entertainment here at Celestial Oddities, so we hope you guys enjoy, and if you do, please feel free to share it around. One thing I want to correct myself on, because I was already going into my spiel, is it's Season 4, not 3. And as soon as I said it, I realized I said 3, but we're going to, correct that right now. It's Season 4, Episode 9 of Knights of the Nephilim. Sometimes you forget what season it is because there's just too many episodes over the years. But we are very excited to be on Season 4, be bringing you some great content, some great guests this season as always. Next week, we launch Celestial Oddities Pair of Normal Guys podcast Season 4 as well, with our first episode being about Russian sleep experiments. So make sure you jump in next week to check that out as well. Got a lot of entertainment coming for you guys. As always, we do want to thank our sponsors. That's going to be Arsnosis, Goetic Impressions, Little Shop of Lilith, Belladonna's Botanicals, Arachne Arcane Services, The Telemancer, and Limitless Liberation. Throughout this evening, we will take a break to listen a little bit more about these companies, who they are, where you can check them out, and if we have any type of promo codes to hook you guys up with, we'll certainly do so. Make sure you pick up something for yourself or for something for a loved one. They're great companies and they make great material, and I love that they are sponsors of the show. Now, we're going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about tonight's guest, which I'm very excited to bring on, and that's Samuel David. And Samuel David is a Mesopotamian polytheist, artist, writer, researcher, and educator based in the American Midwest. His presentations at local pagan festivals, national and international conventions include lectures, rituals, and workshops. He is also the author of multiple books, a couple of which are LIONESS, The Song of Inanna, which is the first traditional hymn to Inanna published in 3,500 years, which is absolutely amazing. The book called Rod and Ring, which got a lot of publicity and a lot of promotion within the occult circles, and that is an initiation into a Mesopotamian mystery tradition. And then lastly, his newest publication called The Red Shepherd, which is a book towards a new image of Dumuzid. And we'll be talking about, a little bit of all three of those tonight and much, much more. We have a fun and exciting episode. So, as always, grab your ritual athames and put on your ceremonial attire, light your candles and focus your desires, step into the circle and intone the sacred names, give offering and praise, and stare into the flames as we conjure the spirit that is Samuel David. All right, folks, we are live right now with Samil. David, thank you so much, brother, for coming on the show tonight.
Thanks for having me. You've conjured me from the comfort of the netherworld, and here I am, live in the American Midwest, ready to rock and roll.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, brother. I have a lot that I want to ask you tonight because you are a specialist in a field that by no means am I a specialist in, but I certainly have a lot of love for, and that is Mesopotamian lore, mythology, and practice. Such a vast field to cover, and I give you credit for even taking on the task because there's so many names, so many backstories that are interweaved and interconnected. So it's a pleasure to get to speak to you about some of that this evening.
Yes, likewise. Thank you for having me.
Now, I normally start with, where did you start and how did you get into it? But one of the things I want to talk about tonight, and I think you can kind of piggyback off that if you don't mind, is Mesopotamian history is very interesting because it's the oldest really understanding that we have on gods and goddesses, and it predates Christianity or Abrahamic faith. It predates pretty much everything that we know of, and it's interesting that it was the bedrock for so many other cultures and religions that came afterwards. But I think just like you and myself and so many other people, the religions that stemmed after the Mesopotamian lore are what allowed us to find Mesopotamian lore to then explore that. So I know for yourself from past interviews and things you've done that you had said that you kind of found, your interest in Mesopotamia through the Bible, which is interesting because I did as well. I mean, reading different passages, wondering who are these cultures of people that sometimes were talked about in good light, but a lot of times were talked about in bad light and looked at like evil villains. So I wanted you to kind of start there. Tell us your story and how you became, a specialist in this field. But I just thought that was great that it spawned Abrahamic faiths, who then spawned the interest in Mesopotamian lore for a lot of us out there.
So a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I was a member of the Pentecostal church. I grew up in that community, in that dynamic. It was in my household, and all of the heroes of my childhood were derived specifically from the Bible. And despite my ardent love of Hebraic scripture, there was always that tickle in the back of my mind, or as Pentecostal would say, there was an unction, a divine unction in my spirit. And I started reading the Bible on my own at a very young age and started asking a lot of the uncomfortable questions, like, why are the ancient Hebrews killing these various nations that they encounter? Or why are the gods of these contemporaneous people to the ancient Hebrews so evil? In the book of Jeremiah, there's the specific reference where the prophet is admonishing the people of the city, and the women tell him that when they worship the Queen of Heaven, and that could be whether that would be Astarte, Ishtar, Inanna, or even Asherah, whenever they worshipped the Queen of Heaven and burned incense in her name and poured out libations and baked cakes, they knew increase, and they didn't know famine, they didn't know war, they didn't know, all of the vehicles that would become their downfall. And they go on to say in that passage, ever since we put off this worship, we've known all of these things. So, that struck a deep chord in me. And that was one of the questions that I asked. If these people were worshiping this deity who supplied all of their needs according to her riches and glory, then why is that such a bad thing? And then, I get on to reading about weeping for Tammuz in the book of Ezekiel. So I had all of these little glimpses into the ancient Near East as far as cultic practices, as far as religions, as far as deities and the people that worship these deities. And it's so fascinating just in hindsight as I'm listening to podcasts that feature individuals who are deconstructing their Christian identity. what's interesting is there is that common thread that the Bible is essentially our gateway drug both into a different spiritual paradigm, but also our gateway drug out of that superstructure. While I was Pentecostal, while I was Christian, I still had this polytheist bent, and I've often joked in the past that I was dancing the tango between polytheism and Christianity. And, even while I was attending church, I was still practicing what essentially would have become Wicca, at least in my estimation and as far as my understanding, because, I was exposed to Charmed and Buffy and Sabrina the Teenage Witch, the early version, not the Netflix version. And, so I've got Christ in one ear and the greater gods of the ancient Near East and the Levant and well into Central Asia and the other. So, there came a point in my life, despite, all of my quote unquote intersecting identities, that, I still wanted to be that good Christian boy, if you will. And at a certain point in my life, I faced some struggles and really had an about-face turn and, returned to the church. It was a very brief return, mind you, and went into Christian ministry and was studying apologetics at the same time, because there's this emphasis in Christian ministry to stand strong in your faith and be able to explain the things of your faith that others may find troublesome. And once again, while I'm in Christian ministry, engaged in men's Christian ministry, men's Bible study, leading youth, and doing work as a hospital chaplain, there was this constant sensation, this constant unction, as I mentioned earlier, that something isn't right here. I'm trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole, and Christian apologetics was my undoing, if you will. So I completely divested myself and realized that I've been pulled into an opposite direction for so long. I need to give into this, and I need to invest myself wholeheartedly, because there is something there that's calling to me, whether that would be some ancestor that, has grabbed me by the ear and, is leading me into some direction, or whatever the case may be. And here I am now, 2023. I've got 3 books under my belt, and I look back on my formative years with a great deal of satisfaction, because if it wasn't for Christianity, I would not be where I am today. So I'd like to thank my former Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
I love that, though, because you know what? It's actually very reminiscent of a discussion I had the other night. I'm a member of the Sect of the Horn God, which is a left-hand path organization that I belong to, and we do monthly meetings. And this past meeting was specifically about that. Where was each member that attended? Where was your foundation in religion and in theology, and how did that shape you in one fashion or another? And whenever it was my turn to speak, I said almost exactly what you did, that I don't condemn it like most Satanists or most left-hand path practitioners. In fact, I've given praise to Christianity in the sense that if it wasn't for Christianity, I wouldn't become the devil, or wouldn't have become the devil worshiper that I am today. And I don't spit in the face of it, because I learned their way. I learned the understanding of that religion and the ins and outs and the characters and the names and the gods, or God, and that allowed me to then explore so many other different paths, which allowed me to find out who I was. So if it wasn't for the thing that I wasn't, I wouldn't have become the thing that I am. And, I think that's really, a benchmark for so many people, because I would fair to say that 95% of all left-hand path practitioners I know started out as Christians. And, if you think about that, there's something to be said there, that all of these people, no matter how vehemently against it or accepting you are of it, if you're on the left-hand path and you stem from it, it somehow in one way, shape, or another formed who you are today. And I'm not the one that has to be anarchist against it. I am happy to say that formed me into what I am today. I don't accept it as a religion that I follow, but it certainly shaped who I am. As you said, there was characters in the books that just stood out to me. And there were so many strong passages. I mean, thinking like, in the Gospel of Matthew, when it talked about Jesus driving out a demon and into the pigs, and they said, well, I am Legion, and all of these things. I'm like, well, I need to know more about these creatures and these beings. And then I started reading non-canonical parts of the Bible and Gnostic, Gospels and things, and finding out different sides of Jesus that weren't even talked about in the Bible, and how he had a dark side to him when he was a child. And I'm like, okay, well, this is interesting. So I'm like, there's
people dead and creating birds out of clay. I love it. Absolutely.
Exactly. Love it. He killed a neighborhood boy because he, pissed him off and had to bring him back and everything. So it's really interesting. That it is the foundation for so many of us who've gone to different paths.
And, building upon that, unfortunately, that is the spiritual structure or the spiritual thread that's woven through Western culture, especially here in the States, despite the fact that those of us who do have and possess critical thinking skills, despite the fact that we do know that there was that distinct separation, that the founding fathers of this country were largely deists and had specific ideas about how this nation was to be founded. We know that, but our contemporaries and even people in past generations would say otherwise. So, despite the fact that we all have these disparate spiritual traditions, we know what we have come out of. We know what superstructure we're still working within. And I really think that it is a valiant, noble effort that, each day we wake up, we're making that conscious choice to live a life that is meaningful despite what we have been told, while we were members of the church or while Christianity had that influence on our lives.
Well, and I think we're very fortunate as well, at least, in our country, because we can choose to say, you know what, no, I don't resonate with that, and I'm going to move over to this way and study Mesopotamian or study any other type of culture in the world that we want. We can study Palamayombe or Kimbanda or anything that we choose to from this country without much ridicule, other than maybe people talking shit on us. But if you go to countries like Egypt and some of the Middle Eastern countries, where if you were to step out and do a left-hand path practice, there's a good chance you might be stoned to death still to this day or murdered. And I think a lot of people forget that.
Yeah, it is definitely a very sobering thing to think about. I was born in Pakistan, and I lived there for a while before I came to the States. My father is a former Christian missionary, and my mother is a convert from Islam. Her father was a convert, and that's what started the chain of events that led to her accepting Christ as her savior. And when he left Islam and became a Christian, his father and his brothers attempted an honor killing, because people don't understand here in the West, that is considered apostasy. When you convert to another religion, it's blasphemy, it's apostasy, it's an immediate death sentence.
Yeah.
And, he escaped with his life and, was able to start a family. And, one of the many things that we take for granted here in the West. And it baffles me to this day. We've got all these things that we argue about when you literally look at the news, and it's like, what is that quote from the Kardashians? Kim, people are dying. And I think about that often.
And when it's
especially
true,
in light of all this.
Well, people don't, like I said, I don't think that even a lot of people in the occult scene are aware of that still to this day. They think like, oh yeah, once upon a time they killed, I speak from a left-hand path perspective, but once upon a time they killed our kind. No, they still do. It's just not here. It's still very much happening today, folks, and it's sad that there are a lot of places out there that you do not have religious freedom. So it's a true gift that we do, and that we can study cultures from anywhere and accept that into our ideology, accept that into our practice. It's very fortunate because not everybody has that.
Yeah, and for those those Muslims who live in the Middle East, who live in Central Asia, who live in South Asia, despite the fact that they are professing Muslims, if they are occultists, that is something that they do not speak about. That is something that is never publicly addressed. It is something that they they hold their cards close to their chest, and despite all that, despite this notion that occult practices, magical practices are haram or taboo, there's still that current where people like you and I who are practitioners, we're still getting and this is speaking metaphorically, we're still getting those people, if we were in that culture, knocking on our back door at midnight, seeking our services, and we're doing these back alley transactions. So things like that are alive and well to this day.
Oh, absolutely. It's just crazy to think about, man. I mean, it's like I said, it's something that some of us know, not everybody does, and it's still going on. So folks, take a little bit more appreciation of your freedom if you have it, and if you are in a country practicing that you could be killed for it. And I know several practitioners in the Middle East who are Satanists who have to keep it very much under lock and key. Just make sure you're careful with what you do, and hopefully someday you find the freedom that we should all be able to enjoy. Now, you said you were originally born, did you say Iran or Iraq?
In Pakistan.
Oh, in Pakistan. I don't know. Yeah, I got you. So
it's in that general area.
I don't know why I said either of those two. You did say Pakistan. I don't know. No, question. Do you think that that's something that led you back to Mesopotamian history? Because obviously that area now is Pakistan or Iran and Iraq areas were once upon a time the Mesopotamian kingdom. So do you think that that's what led you back to it, or what? I mean, do you really? I know obviously you read the Bible and that caught pieces of your attention and it pulled you that way, but do you think that it's something to do with your ancestry?
It's funny that you say that, because years ago I would never have given that any thought, and like many of us, I did the Ancestry.com and 23andMe, and for those who are watching or listening, don't waste your money on Ancestry, because it's gonna my results told me that I had that I was part Japanese, so whatever, which is highly unlikely. But my 23andMe results indicated that there was this migratory pattern, if you will. So we've got North Africa, West Asia, and then into Central Asia, and then into parts of South Asia where India is. And I think about that now, just in the sense that there are these topics of conversation where we have this quote unquote ancestral memory, and people are getting in touch with things that are outside of their comprehension as human beings. And several years ago, I was in a year and a half, or no, I take that back. I misspoke. I was in a year and a month program, if you will, that was led by a mental health practitioner, and it was esoterically bent, and it was actually billed as a men's mysteries group. And so for a year and a month, we engaged in all of these rituals, if you will. And one of the final rituals was encountering our ancestors and walking backwards through these various generations. And it just so happened that during the course of this ritual, I encountered my maternal ancestors. So it started with my deceased grandfather, and then his mother, and her father, and it just kept going back. And at a certain point, I encountered this individual whose face was obscured, but I could make out their form. And I had this immediate sense that this is someone that I should know. But despite the fact that I had this inner knowing that they are someone I should know, there was still this mystique about them. So I have no clue whether it's, the voice of my childhood that's, speaking out to me from my past, or if it's the voice of an ancestor from the distant past. Whatever the case may be, I find it fascinating, but I'm also mindful of the fact that regardless of my ethnicity, regardless of my ancestry, regardless of where I've come from, this is where I am now, and this is where I feel at home. This is where, I have built my own altar, built up my shrine. I'm sitting just adjacent to the temple that's in my home. So, here I am. Let's go from here. I
think, I'm a firm believer in that myself, that I think that two different sides of that current. I think that, our ancestors do come through to us to lead us in certain directions, and I also believe that we come through to ourselves from past lives of our own. And I feel that there's some people that I know that are listening in the comments right now, some of them which are my students, that we've been able to connect to past ancestors as well as past versions of themselves who have helped lead them into where their practice are now and still evolving. So I think that that's very powerful, and that very well could be what led you, I don't want to say so far off track, because it's a good track to be off, but I mean to pull you in a way that you don't see a lot of people with a true understanding of Mesopotamian history. I think you had spoken about this before, that it's easy for a lot of left-hand path practitioners to look at Mesopotamian and be like, oh, that's the ultimate version of evil. They have a Reshkegel and Nigal, and they have, you can look at, there was a book that recently was written that was very good, but it was called Liber Tiamat, and it talked about how Apsu and Tiamat, actually, well, let's just go with her for a moment, created the anti-cosmic current, and how after they killed her consort Apsu, that she employed Kingu, and with the blood being spilt of Kingu, as they created the humans of clay, the half that were created with the blood mixed with the mud of Kingu, created Luciferian and Satanism, and created the minds that were to be the overthrowers of the cosmic order. So very reminiscent of the Garden of Eden story, and those of Cain bloodline. The Cainites and everybody in between were all from Cain, because that was Samael and Lilith, or Samael and Eve sleeping together and creating Cain, and Abel was Adam and Eve, and that's why Cain killed him. It was the impulse. So you get into a lot of that. I mean, you can use those as ideologies to make sense of things. But when one of the things you said, and I very much agree with, is that when you go back to the basis of it, they were first. They were before all these other currents, so they weren't really looking at it in the same light that we are and saying like, oh, we're doing this current that's against the status quo. No, they were the current that was there. And folks, you have to understand that Mesopotamia encompassed several different very large areas of thousands of miles over hundreds of years that each kind of put their own spin. They each had their patron deities, and they would then mix their attributes of that deity with some of the others that already existed and make it a prominent aspect of that deity. So sometimes you might get a specific god who now has attributes of 4 other gods that were before them. So it gets very difficult to pinpoint where it started, what it came from, and we don't have any type of Mesopotamian canon to go back to. We have the snippets and shards that we're fortunate enough to have, thank the higher power that we have it. But unfortunately, some of that hasn't even been able to be translated because it's very, very hard to read. So I just, definitely wanted to bring that up and get your thoughts on that, how a lot of people use that today is in like a left-hand path modality when really that is not the case.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because this has been an ongoing conversation that I've had with one of my friends, Shay Boulay, who's been on on your show as
yes.
well. And, we've kicked around the idea of collaborating on a future project that addresses this. And what's interesting is when we look at the source material that we are, quote unquote, negotiating from, if you were to look at the myth, the Enuma Elish, or the Babylonian creation myth, where we get Tiamat, where we get, at least in that incarnation, we get Apsu. What's interesting to note that many people do not know, and I say this as someone who has studied that myth extensively, and I've written an adaptation of it that has not been formally published, but for a while it was posted on my blog, and then I've decided to take it down because that's going to be the basis of a future book of my own. But when you look at that creation myth, that myth arc that was created and excised into clay, and we've found it all these years later, that was written as religious propaganda to substantiate the elevation of the god Marduk over all of the other gods of Babylon. And outside of the myth, Tiamat does not have a cultic presence. She has an effigy, she had an effigy, and she had what many would believe to be a shrine, but it was more or less like a storage closet. And her effigy would be brought out at the beginning of the new year, which coincided with the vernal equinox. And it was during that time where the battle between her and Marduk was reenacted, and then at the end she was, her effigy or puppet, more or less, would be ritually slain, and all of the elements of the myth would be acted out, and then she would be put away into her storage bin, her storage closet, whatever you want to refer to it as. And outside of that myth, outside of this cultic pageant, if you will, the additional references to her, at least that we know of, based on the translated documents, were few and far between. She's mentioned in what is the equivalent of a Mesopotamian commentary. So think of it like not the Hebrew Old Testament, but think of it like the texts that are comprised or comprise the Midrash, where content and subjects are expounded upon in a scholarly manner, but they're not really accepted as a fact. It's just something to think about, to philosophize upon. So we have this, and that's not to say, and I want to make this explicitly clear to listeners and viewers, that I have no qualms with the left-hand path. My friends are, and I know this is a silly qualifier, some of my best friends are members of the left-hand path. But, if we are pursuing a spirituality that is compelling us to be our noble selves and to connect with something that is our truth or a higher truth, then by all means pursue it, so long as you're not doing harm to yourself or others. And, in this ramble that I'm on, one thing I also wanted to impress is, despite the dark imagery that these deities have, or these spirits that attend to these deities as their factotums or their emissaries, or even their divine emanations, the Mesopotamians believed that chaos and disorder were the ultimate taboo, the anathema, if you will. They prized order and divine order, civilization, all of the things that make a civilization what it is today. whether that would be from streetlights to paved walkways to roads, probably taxes and all the things that go with it. Those were the things that they prized the most because they believed that they were gifts from the gods. So, despite the fact that we have this ideology that they were the originators of an antinomian current, unfortunately, that is not 100% accurate.
I agree.
Fight me in the comments, send me hate mail. I'm cool with that.
Well, I think a lot of people don't like to hear that, but there's a different viewpoint from then to now. Back then they gave face and name to everything. They gave face and name to the understanding of currents that existed in their world. So it wasn't about rebellion. It was about understanding death, about understanding chaos, about understanding plague and sickness, understanding famine and understanding, disease of crops and everything involved. Now, the darker aspects are about rebellion. They're about rebelling against the social order or the humanity or whatever it might be. It's a different stance. It's a different place of pivot, and I think people need to understand that. Now, does it take away any of the darkness of Mesopotamian history? Absolutely not. There is certainly darkness there. It is a great way that the author of Liber Tiamat was able to paint a picture of anti-cosmic Satanism through that. Yeah, it was actually very strong. I read it, and I'm like, I never thought of it that way. And the king, the blood of Kingu created the Satanists, and it makes sense. But that is an interpretation, and as Samuel said, folks, there was a lot of extrapolation off of the stories. People were able to add to the stories that we today take as like that was the ultimate story. That might not have been the original story. It was additives to additives. We don't realize that was a big thing in everything that we focus on. Even looking at the non-canonical biblical side of things or a lot of the Jewish lore out there in Abrahamic faith, a lot of the rabbis added on their extrapolation through the Zohar and through other things to these main stories that weren't originally existent, but then now in modern society we've adapted it in and we're like, did you know the other piece of the story there? So you have to decide where that defining line is, but there is dark aspects. You have Nergal and Resh Gagal, taking over the dead and being able to work with the dark chthonic realms, and that's their understanding of it. So I don't think a lot of people realize how much that civilization over that period of time influenced everything to come, because we have Sharon or however you want to say the name in Greek, the boatman. Now, that originally came from Mesopotamian history. You have the Great Flood of Noah. That came from Mesopotamia, long before Noah was ever written in the book. So there's a lot of things. Even you look at the goddesses, you look at Inanna as your first book, Persephone, her journey to the underworld would have never happened if it wasn't for the journey to the underworld of Inanna. So, there's a lot to be said about our understanding of where things are nowadays if it wasn't for that precursor of a civilization that gave us rich history. And that's rich history from only, as I said, folks, very, very small fragments that we have. I couldn't imagine if we had all of the books from back then what we would know.
Our minds would be blown. And to build on what you said, what's interesting is, so the majority of the material that we have, the myths, the liturgy, the compositions that we have, despite the fact that these cuneiform cultures derived their written language and then later their spoken language from the Sumerians, we have to thank the Babylonians, the Akkadian Babylonians, for writing all of these things, for composing these things, because the myths that we would say, oh, this is a Sumerian myth. Yes, it's Sumerian because it was written in Sumerian, and the names of the gods are rendered in Sumerian. But if you look at the period in which they were written by the Babylonians. And, to add upon your point about creation myths and, all of these other stories that were found in the Bible, in addition to the Enuma Elish or the Babylonian creation myth, we have other creation myths that have been translated that some are completely counter to the Babylonian creation myth. One specific myth features the god Enki and the goddess Ninhursag as creating human beings, and they created 7 men and 7 women out of the mud of the primal ocean. So it's interesting that we have these various stories, and one way that I like to use to explain the complexity is, think of how we are here in the United States, and I'm going to use New York and Chicago and Dallas, Texas, and Los Angeles in this example. Let's pretend that each of these cities had its own cultic practice, had its own liturgy, had its own state religion, if you will, but they all worship the same gods. The challenge, though, is despite the fact that they're all existing in the same period of time, they're existing in the same country, if you will, they are large, vast cities. The stories told about these gods, or the hymns that are composed for these gods in New York, are completely different than the hymns and stories of these gods that are composed, sung, and enacted in Los Angeles or Dallas, Texas. So they were all contemporaneous, but they all had their own individual bent in terms of the cultic expression. We also find this in smaller settlements. So outside of the major cities, you have these little settlements that were essentially like tribal areas. I know, the word tribe has a lot of baggage behind it now because of our conceptions of colonization. But, we have these small communities that are just a drop in the bucket that had their own completely different cultic practices and spiritual expressions. So it's a rich tapestry that is just woven through time with all of these cultures existing at the same time and blending and rebelling. And I find it so incredibly fascinating that, in ancient history, at least in the history classes that I remember from elementary school and middle school and high school, there was this emphasis on the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans. But if we look at the history of the Mesopotamian people as a whole, it's just as complex. It's just
Absolutely.
as rich. It's just as baffling and paradoxical. So, yeah.
I think it might even be more so. I mean, like you said, it's not something touched upon in high school. I do remember them teaching Egypt and Greek and Roman and everything, like you said, in Hebrew and all of that. But I don't remember them ever talking much about Mesopotamia or the Assyrians or any of that. So it was very interesting that they skipped this culture for some reason. But yet it's so rich in creating everything that came afterwards and how everything else is based off of. I mean, even looking at the gods of their culture, how gods pretty much around the world were demonized by Christianity, their gods were demonized too. And I mean, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I want to jump into some of the left-hand path gods that, kind of stem from there and see what your thoughts are. I have read things in the past that, Marduk is associated with Bel and then associated with being Belial or Belial. Have you ever come across anything that would make you think that Marduk would eventually be transformed into one of the highest ranking demons in history? Is there anything you've ever seen that gave you more of an evil or sinister side of Marduk?
Well, what we have to consider is the gods possess their own antithesis. So looking at Inanna, for example, because she is a classic example, and if you look at her myths as a whole, instead of just the descent, she embodies a number of Luciferian characteristics and traits. And, she's the goddess who defies status quo. But, we'll focus on Marduk. So we have Marduk in Babylon, and then we have Baal or Bel, Beel, Baal, however that word is pronounced. That word just means Lord.
Lord, yeah.
And, we have it in the Levant, and, he was worshipped by the Canaanites, also worshipped by the Hebrews, which many Christians today would just completely scoff at. But, again, we just have these titles. with the word Belial, unfortunately, if you look at the etymology of the word historically, looking specifically at the historical aspect, that word in ancient Hebrew, if I remember correctly, meant worthless.
Worthless,
so we've got the spiritual current, and I'm of the impression that, and this is, of course, attested to historically, that there is no static culture, and cult evolves over time. And we have numerous examples of cultural diffusion and evolution. We've got that major example with the Greeks and the Romans. But as the conceptions of these deities traveled throughout the ancient world, and, you know, your neighbor over here who worships one god says, oh, hey, I like your god. They're similar to mine, but I can't pronounce their name, so I'm just going to call them by the god that I know. And so over time, as we evolve, as our comprehension of these deities evolves, and even now to this day, we find echoes of these deities within the left-hand path. We find them within the Goetic grimoires, and it's just so fascinating. So, you know, from a modern perspective, if we're not taking any of the historical context into consideration, you know, why not? Why can't aspects of Marduk be incorporated into the spiritual comprehension of this demon, this demonic spirit, this being that, you know, people do work with or venerate?
I think that, and I've talked about this on my show and talked about this on other things, you know, lessons that I've given, that I really do look at the gods as deific masks of primordial currents. So there are primordial currents out there that exist that can be tapped into and used in ritual, and we paint the understanding through theology and religion and faith. But as you said, we might turn Marduk into Bel and turn Bel into Belial or Beliar, and doesn't mean that there isn't power there. You can still worship that deity and have power from it, even if it stemmed from an original earlier deity. I mean, a good example of that would be Baal Zebul, Lord of the Palace, Lord of the Most High, Lord of the Air and the Flyers. You know, once a revered god of dignity and who took care of his people. The Hebrews, seeing all the sacrifices that were taking place on the altar and all of the blood and all of the flies that kept landing on all of the sacrifices, and they were just, you know, disgusted by it, and gave him the name Baal Zebub, you know, Lord of the Flies, Lord of Shit, Lord of Pestilence and Disease. You know, they wanted to demigrate it, but, you know, it became this revered devil that everybody worships, where it once was a god completely opposite of that. But both have their own power in their own time. And, you know, Eliphas Levi or Manly Hall, one of the others, says a god defined as a god dethroned. And, you know, when we try to put it into a box, you kind of take away from it. There's multiple aspects and attributes to these deities and to these currents. And when you try to think too much about every little aspect of it, I think we take away from its ultimate resonance.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, it's funny because coming from a Christian background, there is this, you know, this deeply held, it's not even a notion. It is, you know, intrinsic to the faith that there is no questioning the nature of God. And, you know, at a certain point in my life, and I do believe that the reality of the gods, that they are outside of the comprehension of the human mind, you know, because, you know, if we were to see a god in all of their glory, it would just baffle us. I don't know if anyone has experienced firsthand meteorological phenomenon, but years ago, I was driving down the highway and there was a thunderstorm that was looming in. And as I'm driving, just a few yards away is a farmer's field that I'm driving past. And it's completely dark. And suddenly the sky lights up with the most brilliant blue that you could ever imagine. It bordered on white. And this huge bolt of lightning struck the ground. And I just remember watching it happen, it was like time slowed down. I swerved and just kept driving thinking, what the fuck did I just see? What just happened? And in that moment, I was like, this is how people perceive the gods. And, for a while, I identified as a hard polytheist. And the more I study, the more I implement my spiritual practice, the more I've come to the realization it doesn't matter. Because if a god can transcend human comprehension, why can that same god not be an aspect of meteorological phenomenon, an archetype, a dream, a vision, an immutable or mutable force that can take on these various things, can be approached in a psychological manner, can be approached in an archetypal manner, can be approached in a devotional manner that they are flesh and blood just like we are. And I think that when we stop thinking about the minute details, our spirituality can grow, can blossom, can take on a completely different life of its own, because we're no longer confined to the elements that are rife within the Christian paradigm, that are rife within, aspects of the Muslim paradigm or the Jewish paradigm. And I think that's a revolutionary idea. It completely defies the status quo altogether.
Well, I think we should, redefine that. I think, once upon a time they said to worship multiple gods is a sin. I don't believe so, because as you said, God is so undefinable, the effable, beyond comprehension, that the only way we can pay reverence to God is through the demigods, is through the other names that we attribute to that source. And one can find salvation through Jesus Christ the same as one can through Belial or through Satan or through whatever gods you want to pick. We can find our own salvation through that. And that's a testament that these things are just fractals and just shards of the one power. And Jesus himself said, those who look inside themselves and find me will find the kingdom of glory. And what he was speaking of is look inside ourselves and find that fruit of knowledge and that power that's within us, and use that and project that to find our salvation. It doesn't have to be under his name or under Yahweh's name. It can be under any name. And that is the beautifulness of it, that we can use our faith. Faith, folks. A lot of Satanists will say faith is disgusting. Faith is an abomination. No, faith is everything. Even if you are a left-hand path practitioner, faith is what you make it. Faith is your loyalty to what you believe in. And I think there's a lot of strength there. And like I said, you can have multiple different paths and have 5 people with different gods, and all of them reach the same end. And that's what's beautiful about it.
Absolutely. And, I love the fact that you said that you can have faith. And, you mentioned, the aspects of other saviors. 2 instances that I have. One of my friends related an experience that they had that helped them break out of, a life that was affected by addiction. And they told me that it was Belial who was instrumental in helping them, break out of that cycle and live an enriched life. And, spending time with them, I just thought, if you told me this 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I would think this is insane. But it's just so fascinating how these beings, these spirits, can impact our lives. And, back to the point of faith, I have met Satanists, left-hand path practitioners that have been more Christ-like than Christians themselves. I mentioned Shay earlier, but there are times where whenever he and I hang out, sometimes he'll say something and he'll just get talking so passionately, and I'll just stop and say, dude, I just want to let you know right now, and this is me speaking from a former Christian, perspective, the way you sound right now is like an evangelist who is on fire for Jesus. And I mean that.
Yes.
in the most sincere way. And it's so refreshing to encounter people that have this inner peace about themselves that completely defies the expectations that one would have within a cultural paradigm that's defined by Christianity. So, I'm not one to say, many paths, one God or one destination, what have you, because it's all a spiral. But it's just so fascinating how people's lives can be changed and how faith can shape a life, and deliverance doesn't just exist within a Christian paradigm. It exists in any spiritual paradigm.
Well, and I like that you said that, because I've told a lot of people that I talk to that some of the deepest Satanism that you can get into, for myself, I take attributes of anti-cosmic Satanism and other things, but I look at it that an anti-cosmic Satanist, even though it sounds so dark and scary to everybody, the point of it is to return back to source. Not Yahweh, not the God that created the world, or the demiurgos or demiurge, but to go beyond that. If you want to go with, Hebraic terms, we'd go back to Ein. Go back to the source. Return to Tiamat and Apsu if we want to do it Mesopotamian. To go back to the primordial source. So you could say, well, that's horrible. You're wanting the world to be destroyed and dissolve. Not necessarily. I'm wanting myself to reach the level of dissolvement, to absolution, where I am gone and I return back to sender. So while some that might sound terrible and evil and dark, what could be more Christian-y or more holy than to return back to the one true God, the absolute original source? So when you're passionate about it and you teach people and they're like, that's absolute abomination, I'm like, no, I'm the holiest man on earth. You just think I'm evil. So, like you said, faith is a funny thing. And my friend Natasha, who's the creative director of Celestial Oddities Radio, she just left a comment. She's left a couple, and I want to jump into thanking some of these folks here in a second, but she left a comment here that says, I've heard that multiple times from people about Belial actually saving them from addiction. So very interesting to know that that's a common thread there. Now, real quick, folks out there, Candy, Sarah, Eddie, John, let's see who, Vicky, Cindy, and Natasha, Lyra, and anybody else I might be missing, Augustine, Justin, Kayla, and anybody else I missed. Thank you guys for all your comments throughout this. I've been throwing them up on the screen for anybody listening. You can check them out. We appreciate all of you. Real quick, I think we probably should take a commercial break, but I want to go quick with it because I haven't even got into Samuel's books yet. We've been just deep diving on some lore, which I could go all night, but I think we should probably take a quick break. So we're going to jump in, and I'm going to do this differently because it was brought to my attention this whole season, now that we have video as a part of this, that when I play my sponsors, you guys are seeing the screen. You're seeing me show the sponsor. I can hear the commercial. No one's hearing it. I didn't know this entire season until last week. So I'm going to try to do something very strange today because I don't know why it's not working for you guys. I hear it crystal clear. The soundboard hears it. I'm going to take my headphones and stick it on my microphone when I play the commercial so you can hear it that way. I don't know if it'll work. If not, I'm back to the drawing board. But we're going to try to go ahead and jump to a quick commercial break and let you hear a little bit about some of our sponsors. So we'll be right back after this. Knights of the Nephilim podcast would like to thank our sponsor, Arcane Arcane Services. Arcane Arcane Services is a husband and wife duo comprised of Baron and Baronessa Aragni. With over 40 years of practical experience, they are masters of the occult arts through various practices and paradigms, such as necromancy, high magic, black witchcraft, and more. They are published authors under their own publishing house, the Arcane Press. They offer books, courses, spell work, consultations, ritual tools, and more. All of their products are handmade of the highest quality material and empowered through ancient rites. If you wish to know more about them or their business, or you require their services, please feel free to contact them at aragnearcaneservices.com. That is Aragni, A-R-A-I-G-N-E-E, arcaneservices.com. And if you use promo code KOTN, you will get 10% off of your overall order or purchase as a special highlight of them being a sponsor of this show. Thank you so much, guys. Knights of the Nephilim podcast would like to thank our sponsor, Goetic Impressions. Goetic Impressions is a company dedicated to the faithful creation of advanced ritual tools by following grimoire guidelines as closely and as feasibly as they can in the modern world. Follow them on Instagram, Facebook, or their website, goeticimpressions.com, to stay informed on new projects and limited-time items that they roll out frequently. For listeners of Knights of the Nephilim podcast, you can use the promo code KOTN10 for 10% off of your overall order. Again, that is KOTN10 for 10% off of your overall order. And make sure you check out their Facebook, Instagram, and website. Once again, the website is www.goeticimpressions.com. Again, that is goeticimpressions.com for absolutely everything for your ritual needs. Fantastic items, quality items, greatly priced, quick shipping. Can't speak highly enough about these guys. Absolutely wonderful team, and I'm glad to have partnered with them. Thanks, guys. Knights of the Nephilim podcast would like to thank our sponsor, Arsnosis. Arsnosis was formed by Diogo Cells Pimentel, an artist located in northeast of Brazil in the state of Bahia, which is the birthplace of the greatest artist in the country. Involved with occultism since 2009, starting in shamanic practices until reaching Western occultism through the paths of Luciferianism, Thelema, Goetic ceremonial magic, angelic and Enochian magic. Since 2017, he has added his art of drawing and painting to magical artifacts, putting the energy of his practice and personal research into the artistic and magical works that he creates. With the auspices of the great King Paimon that governs over all arts and sciences, you can find his work by searching Arsnosis on Facebook and Instagram. It is theurgical work channeled into magical tools made by an adept for adepts. Over time, his work has become known throughout the globe for the care and energy of the will applied to each and every piece that he creates. And with the motto that was propagated in greater proportion by Aleister Crowley, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," he applies the energy of the will of the initiatory path into each and every work. Once again, you can check him out by searching Arsnosis on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks, Diogo. All right, guys, we are back. I don't know if you heard any of that. I only played 3 of the sponsors because I don't know if it's working, and I don't want you guys to sit there forever, and I don't know if we'll jump into another commercial tonight. So that was a sponsorship for our Ragni Arcane Services, Arsnosis, and Goetic Impressions. Also want to make sure I give a shout out to the Telemancer, the Limitless Liberations, and also Belladonna's Botanicals, and then we'll give sometime throughout the show, in fact, I might just do that right now, give a quick shout out to Little Shop of Lilith. We don't have that one recorded, I just read that off every week, but let me go ahead and jump into that real quick, and we'll do that. We'll jump right back with Samuel David to catch up on a little bit of the stuff that I wanted to be jumping into. Little Shop of Lilith is a metaphysical and occult shop run in Butler, Pennsylvania. Natasha has been practicing witch for 2 decades and started Little Shop of Lilith in 2020, with the brick and mortar opening at the end of 2021. What started as intention oils for friends quickly expanded into an online business, and now what regulars lovingly refer to as the local cult. With a background in education and mental health, Natasha's main goal was to be able to offer affordable mental health services to her community. She is a certified emotional intelligence life coach and is currently obtaining her master's in metaphysical sciences and spiritual counseling. Aside from the many products at her shop that she also offers clients can be counseled, mentorship, intuitive energy work, tarot readings, spell work, and more. There are many different activities monthly, from group ritual to 101 classes, full courses, and guest speakers. Little Shop of Lilith encourages people to step into their own power, staying unapologetically authentic in a mission of understanding the integration of both light and dark in the soul, and taking a no-bullshit approach to both magic and healing. So we want to thank her as well and her shop, Little Shop of Lilith. Now, like I said, folks, if you didn't hear the commercials at first, I don't know why that's happening, and I tried something different, but that was a pain in the ass, so I got to try to figure out something different. I just don't understand why. In all aspects, it should work, and has always worked until we added the video element in, which makes no sense that it would not be the same as normal. So we do want to thank you. Now, we're going to go ahead and bring Samuel back on the line here. he has returned. So thank you, to you guys out there, and thank you to our sponsors. So, Samuel, I want to jump into your books, obviously. It's something we haven't been able to jump into, and I know we already started talking about, the goddess Inanna, so I think we should probably start there, and we'll do a little bit about that, a little bit about the rod and ring, and then we'll jump into the final part of the episode, which would be your newest book, which I think we want to, dive a little bit further into. But, what caused you to make LIONESS? What was your inspiration there?
It's funny that you mentioned that question, because that was a completely serendipitous project. I wrote and performed that ritual with a friend of mine, Mariana Vital, who lives in Portugal, and this was actually a ritual for Ishtar Fest, and this is a festival that is hosted every year. It's Mesopotamian oriented, if the name doesn't give it away. And there's workshops, rituals, presentations, you name it, lectures. And I just happened to share that material with Jack Grail. I don't know if anyone's heard about him, but he was fascinated by it, and he proposed the idea that it be adapted into an actual book, because he was, heading into the waters of the publishing world himself, and that book just happened to be the sacrificial lamb that kicked off his publishing house. And I'm truly thankful for that opportunity. Who knew that a 45-minute ritual would become a book that would become well received by countless individuals? I just lost you. I can't hear you.
You hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Figure something else is going down now. Who knows?
Fire your producers, my man. Fire your producers.
So what I was saying is it's amazing. Jack Grell is an amazing writer and teacher. He has some amazing courses out there on Hecate. He has a wonderful course, I think called 50 Rituals for 50 Nights or something like that, where it goes over the Greek magical Coterie and teaches a lot of different rituals. And then obviously his Grell Press, which your book is released through, and then the magnificent Hekateon book that has come out from him. So it's great that he was able to help you kind of push your ritual into a book and made what is a very beautiful piece of art. I mean, it's a very beautiful book.
Thank you. It's not only is it a book, it is a
tribute.
Talismanic object as well. So, it has a place in so many different categories. So again, I am absolutely thankful to Jack for that opportunity that he's afforded to me by publishing that book.
That's awesome. No, I'm glad to hear that. Like I said, it's beautiful, and if you haven't seen it, folks, go check it out. Pick up a copy. I think you can actually pick up a copy right now, I think, through Miskatonic, which, shout out to them. They're not a sponsor of mine, but I'll throw a shout out to them anyway, because I buy way too many books through Larry and through Jack, because they're partners.
Larry's causing so many people to go bankrupt.
Yeah, I'm doomed. I mean, it's been a problem. I mean, you can't see it, but behind my mushroom poster back there, I have an entire library of rare books that I shouldn't have, which is a problem that I love and hate at the same time. Now, I love the story of Inanna, because there's so many different parallels there, like you said, that sparked so many other goddesses and different things. But I always loved the fact, as she got to each gate of the underworld, she stripped one layer of her garments and clothing, which symbolically and mythically would stand for shedding the Archon influences. The 7 garments that she sheds is the 7 planetary influences of the astral realm, so that she can be free of the 7 demons, and it's reminiscent of Jesus when he rose from the tomb, and Mary Magdalene came to him. It says that he exorcised 7 demons from her, and she seen like he did. Well, what that stood for was he exorcised the influence of the archons from her, and she no longer was subject to bestial and earthly desires and influences. She became like a god as he was. He died and was risen, as all good occult orders will have you do. You die and then rise from the dead. So it was, I love the stories of whether it's Persephone, whether it's Inanna, whether it's Jesus, these influences of dying, going to the underworld, raising, and coming back uninfluenced by the things that influence the rest of us. So, what a great story and history. And then obviously you made a book that gives proper tribute to her, which, as we said at the beginning, hasn't been done in 3,500 years, which is pretty awesome. Now let's jump into the second one, Rod and Ring. And I think it's very interesting because what most people might not understand, Rod and Ring is shown in a lot of steels and a lot of different depictions in ancient history. You'll see figures holding rods and rings, and what do they stand for? What is it about? I mean, one of the most famous, and I would love to get your opinion on this actually, is a stone relief cut that's ancient that there's debate on who the woman in the relief is. Some people say that it's Ereshkigal. Some say it's Lilith. Some say that it is a numerous amount of different beings. But the reason I bring this up is that being has talons of a primordial night bird, which would make you think Lilith. But she is in her hand holding a rod and a ring. So could you care to speak a little bit about, what being you think that is, and also how you led into rod and ring?
Next topic. I'm kidding. So, I want to address the historical aspect here, because the notion that it is Lilith was inspired by outdated academia that was put forth by Thorkild Jacobson, who, despite his missteps that have been since debunked by modern Assyriologists and ancient Near Eastern scholars, he put forth the idea that Lilith was a being in the Mesopotamian culture, in the mythos, the cosmology. However, the actual term that he mistranslated is the word LIL, or the symbol LIL, which stands for spirit or breath, ghosts. So it's a bit of a misnomer there, unfortunately. But the concept of the Lil demons, or the Lilaitu, or the Ardat Lili that became Lilith was consistent with the ancient understanding of Lilith as, the being that she is. As far as who I believe that figure is, the rod and the ring are possessed. They're divine regalia that are only possessed by deities who oversee cosmic order. So we have the goddess Inanna, who possesses that regalia. We have the god Enlil, who possesses that regalia, and we have the god Marduk, who possesses the regalia, and the god Shamash, who possesses the regalia. Enlil is the de facto chief of the gods. He's known as the Lord of all lands, and we have Marduk, who I'm sure many people know already, so no introduction is needed there. Inanna, of course, no introduction is needed there. And with Shamash, or Shamash, also known as Utu to the indigenous Sumerian people, he was the god of justice, of judgment. He was the lawgiver. So it's natural that he would be conceived of as a deity who would be possessing the rod and the ring. Now, going on to what that symbol actually is, the rod is a measuring line, and the rope is essentially what is used to execute that measurement. And these tools, or these items, were only used in times of peace, when rulers would be laying the foundations for temples that they dedicated to the gods, or expanding the reach of their cities. As far as the figure themselves, what's interesting is beings that reside in the underworld, and this also applies to humans, and this is accounted for in a myth that's entitled Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld. Humans were believed, at least in in one period of ancient history that when we die, everybody who dies, we all go to the same place. There is no heaven, there is no hell, it's just the abode of the dead. And this notion is actually something that is or was believed by countless ancient Near Eastern cultures. In fact, the early Hebrews believed it. They considered it Sheol or Abraham's bosom. And in the underworld, you are essentially gathered to your people, so you're hanging out with your ancestors, and you're drinking muddy water and eating clay, and you're wearing feathers, you're clothed in feathers, and you take on these avian characteristics. And we have other cultures that believed that birds had this liminal space that they inhabited between heaven, earth, and the underworld. So we have this divine figure who not only has the rod and ring, but they've also got talons. They're also nude, and the gods depicted in a state of undress, that is subject to debate. And when we look at where this plaque or this relief, the burning relief is what it's known as, or the Queen of the Night, what's interesting is when we look at where this item was found and the culture and the time period from which it originated, it was found in essentially what was a brothel. And prostitution, the concept that we have of prostitution now, was completely different than the concept of prostitution in the ancient world. So it is theorized, and the colors that have been determined based on laser spectrometry, or whatever the scientific term is, the primary colors of that relief are red, black, and white. And interestingly enough, those colors are associated with Inanna. They were the colors that were used to decorate her temple complex in Uruk. That isn't to say that being is Inanna herself or Ishtar herself. It is possible that being is a deity that is in Inanna or Ishtar's retinue or circle. So we have a being who's known as an owl maiden. That's the typical translation, who is an envoy of Inanna, and this being possesses avian characteristics and is associated with the night. And what's interesting is, in a translation of an Akkadian hymn, we actually find this same figure approaching men in the night, specifically men who have put off their religious and their cultic duties by neglecting their shrines and neglecting the offerings that are promised to the gods. So, who knows who this being is? It could be Ishtar, it could be Inanna, it could even be Ninlil. Ninlil is the spouse of Enlil,
yep,
and she is the Lady of the Winds or Lady of Spirits, and she also spent time in the underworld in one of her myths. So,
and that was the boat. The boatman actually came from her.
Yes. So we've got all of these complex narratives that are just woven through all these, and despite the heated debate that it sometimes causes, at this point, who cares? If you want it to be a representation of Lilith and you have purchased that icon and it sits on your altar, then by all means worship that spirit as Lilith and let that be a representation. My personal take is I like to create, and this is one of my artistic passions, is creating new cultic icons. I have several cultic idols that I've created myself out of clay, and they are representations of the gods that I worship, and they have their own individual shrine, and they receive their own offerings as representations of those gods. So, we can always look to the past, and at the same time, we can create our new images, forge our new idols, and keep that cultic practice and that spiritual current alive and relevant in this day and age.
And I love that you use clay, because that is a very powerful thing, to make effigies out of clay, your own idea of what they could look like or what your version of them are, and then use that as a item of practice. And there's a lot of potency there, and I'm a heavy exponent of that, so I love that you do that as well.
And this mask, if you can see it behind me.
Yes, I can.
That's actually an early idol that I made several years ago.
Oh, wow, okay.
When I was like, I need to, start creating these images on my own, and, that was styled after the artifact known as the Mask of Worka, or the Mask of Uruk, and it's theorized to be a representation of Inanna. So that was used in countless rituals years ago, and now resides on my bookshelf. So
I love that. No, it can be there forever, and it still always will hold potency for what it was for, and means something to you, and that's what's important. And as you said, the steel relief of the goddess, whoever it is to you, it can be to you, and it still holds power. I do believe that it probably is Inanna, because as what you said, the colors and how there's a lot of other fitting things. And as you said, there's a different understanding of what prostitution was back then to now. You had the sacred prostitution temples, that spawned a whole different topic that we could jump into. We're not tonight because we're running out of time. But I love that. I wanted to definitely get your take on what you thought of that relief, because there has always been so much debate. And I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit. Now, we have 3 other things I would love to jump into in the short time we have. One of them is the Rod and Ring itself. So, why don't you tell the folks out there what to expect with the Rod and Ring book, what kind of workings are within it, and really the encompassment of that book.
So first and foremost, I want to impress upon prospective readers that the material in the book is not only derived from historical source material, but it's also derived from the evolution of my own practice. It is essentially a book that I wish I had years ago when I started on this spiritual journey. There have been some detractors who have complained that it doesn't contain various incantations and rituals and whatnot. And those translations are copyright protected. So trying to get the approval from academic institutions is incredibly difficult. In fact, the letters that I sent were all returned. So clearly these institutions don't want their accurate translations to be featured in what could be considered an occult book. So the material presents a series of gods, a total of 24 deities that were instrumental throughout the ages of the Mesopotamian peoples, and had a primary cult of worship. So it's divided into 4 parts. And in the first part, it introduces one to the reality of these gods and provides certain protocols. It provides certain ritual incantations that help demarcate a ritual space, petition specific threshold guardians to protect your ritual space. It provides purification rituals, provides the steps in consecrating water. The second part of the book takes the supplicant, and that is essentially the first term for a member of this proposed order, a supplicant, out of the inner shrine, and essentially it is a mythopoetic composition in which the reader, or the individual who is going about the initiation, is in a living myth. So they travel across the world much in the same way that Inanna left Uruk and all of her cities to descend into the underworld, much in the same way that Gilgamesh traveled the world in search of immortality. So we do have these aspects of these respective myths that are woven through this. So the reader is introduced to 7 deities that in the course of the book, I have personally taken upon myself to align them with various aspects, these 7 deities, with various aspects of the mundane world. So whether that would be the changing of the seasons or the scribal arts or, the tending of sheep. Dumuzid is prominently featured in one part of this book. And in that part of the book specifically, he gives the reader the gift of a name. And that is crucial because in the third part of the book, the individual who's reading descends into the underworld, and those 7 gods that they previously encountered, each in turn giving a gift, that gift that they have given is surrendered at each gate. And in the course of surrendering those gifts at each gate, the 7 gods of the underworld accept those gifts. And there's an interesting way that I have given the reader the ritual opportunity to leave the underworld without losing their skin, without dying and being hung on a hook for 3 days. But it is still a psychodrama, if you will. And in the 4th part, after rising up out of the underworld, they ascend into the heavens and encounter 7 gods, 7 more gods who oversee. And at the time that this was written, it was derived from Thorkild Jacobson's concept of the 7 gods who decree fate. So these are the gods who, in his thesis, oversaw universal order and the order of the microcosm and the macrocosm. So in that part of the book, you're encountering the presence of Inanna, for instance. So in each of these parts of the book, you're going from an initiate to someone who has been initiated into this system, who moves on into another degree and then a final degree. And in each degree, there's a specific color that's bestowed. There's a specific ritual act that essentially kicks off that particular degree. If you are reading the book, I've given explicit instructions on certain things that have to be created and worn during the course of the ritual. But I highly recommend anyone who is purchasing this book to keep in mind that it's meant to be approached, and this goes without saying, that it's not just something that an individual can use. It's also written so that if you are part of a temple or part of a coven or part of a lodge, you can actually use the source material and adapt it to suit your own needs in an initiatory process, because there is a lot of material that can be adapted for a call and response. So within the course of the book, the intended format is that the reader attends to the material and to these rituals over the course of a year. So it's not something that's like, oh, I'm going to get this book done in a weekend. But that isn't to say that the reader can't do that. It's a choose your own adventure. Go at your own pace. Yeah. If you want to do a year in a day, by all means, do a year in a day. If you want to do it over the course of a month, whatever floats your boat, whatever tickles your fancy, go your own way, choose your own adventure, carve your own path.
Well, I love that, because it's an absolute system, as you said, everything from consecrating the temple and making space to the end, to achieving the goal. And I love that it's a complete system in itself. And as you said, you can go at your own pace. You can do it quick. You can do it slow. I think that unfortunately nowadays people want to go too quickly. I think that people are pulled so many different directions and they don't have focus anymore, and there's a lot of things that cause that to happen these days. But I think there's something to be said about a system taking a long time. because a lot of people are unattracted by that and will walk away from it. But good, maybe it's not for you. And I think that separates the wheat from the chaff, because if you look at it and say, well, this is going to take me a year, fuck that, I'm not going to do this, then good, it's not for you. But to work day in and day out every day for a year or for 2 years, there's a potency there that other practices don't have. And I've said this time and time again, it's like beating a dead horse, but it needs to be stressed. That's why in the Golden Dawn they had you do the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram and hexagram every day, morning, noon, and night for a year at least before you ever did anything else. And there's a lot of people that quit. It said, this sucks, this is boring, I'm not doing this. And that's why they did it. One, it gives you a foundation. It helps you learn the dance of ritual, but it also separates the weak out that doesn't want to really be here, so that you are ready for the next steps, truthfully prepared and dedicated. And your practice certainly is that. I mean, you can't really go into the rites that you paint in the Rod and the Ring without dedication, and that's a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's funny that you mentioned, you know, the pitfalls of that. Years ago, I was part of a Reiki school and had my attunement, and before I can move on to any other degree, I was expected to practice for a specific period of time. And I didn't get my second degree until 2 years after my attunement. And then from that second degree, I still had to wait before I could even move any further. And then I eventually got to my master. And, you know, I thought, oh, this is so great. This is so cool. I'm part of something. And then I find that these other Reiki practitioners are offering a 3-day weekend to become a Reiki master. And all you have to do is pay $1,000 for your 3-day Reiki retreat. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? So you're telling me that all of the practice that I've had to do is just, it's meaningless. It's irrelevant, because I could have just paid $1,000 to have someone put their hands on me and chant and draw some symbols and give me a certificate and say, oh, congratulations, you've been initiated and you're now a master and you can start your own Reiki tradition. No, thanks. Sorry.
And I think that, you know what, though, it's not meaningless, because you spent the time and put the time in to really earn that. And you know what? People that have it after 3 days might say, well, I'm just as high ranked as you are. No, you're not. No, you're not, because you didn't do the work. Natasha just left a comment that said 6 a.m. cold showers. And the reason she's saying that is I said about the dedication. She's one of my students, and she had, and still does, get up and does freezing cold showers at 6 a.m. to kick off her day, and then do a lot of invocation and ritual in the morning before her day even starts. And that's what I teach my students is dedication and you know, really hungering for it and pushing yourself beyond the mortal bounds. And a lot of people won't do that, and that separates the soldiers. And you know what, there are people out there that'll say, you give me $1,000 and I'll just make you that overnight, but you're not made into that. You were just getting some generic title. And there's, and especially in the left-hand path, and I bash my own brothers and sisters all the time because it's fun to do.
Dare you?
I love it. It's like one of my favorite things, honestly. You know, there's so many people that they just started 1 year ago, and then they're like, I'm a Magus. I am the Ipsissimus. I am, and I'm like, you're not anything, bro. You don't know anything. Like, you're the same dude 2 weeks ago that messaged me on how to do a simple elemental rite, and then now all of a sudden you're offering ritual for higher practice. It doesn't make sense. So we live in that age where everybody wants instant gratification. They want it now, and there's a lot of people that are predators that'll take advantage of that and say, you just give me $2,000 and I'll teach you in 1 week what takes 10 years for other lodges and you know, covens out there. Bullshit. You're not teaching them in a week that practice, because there's something to be said, like I said, just to wait. Just the discipline of waiting is a principle in itself that if you skip, you're never going to become a master of anything.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, before we jump into your
become a face on Facebook with, you know, number with 93 in your Facebook bio.
93/93, yes. And you know, and the other thing is, I mean, I think TikTok, and I know you're not on TikTok, and neither am I. I think that there's a big thing with that, is that it became such a cultural thing now to be an occultist, which, you know, I said there's a good and bad to that. It's good because it's leading a lot of people who eventually will become good practitioners to go through a lot of loopholes and falls probably, but that's good. You got to fall and get fucked up a couple times before you can, you know, really get where you need to be. So there are a few that will make it there from that crowd. But unfortunately, most of them are just trash, and that it makes everybody believe that they can be something that they're not, or they're never going to be dedicated to. And as I said, there's a lot of predators that'll take advantage of that. So it comes with the good and bad. But I think a big part of that is the TikTok crowd that, everybody read an article and now I am a teacher. And, that's not how it works, folks.
It's the equivalent of the tourism industry. It's spiritual tourism.
Spiritual tourism, yep.
It's like, hey, let's go to Paris or let's go to Bali. And when you get there, it's like the picture that you have been painted, that has been painted for you and presented to you in this beautiful postcard. You get there and it's like, oh, look at all this graffiti. We're 5 feet away from a slum. What's going on here? So, yeah, it's... Yep. I could go on about TikTok, but you know what? I've got better things to do.
I hear you. We'll cut it there on that subject. Yeah, I feel the same, man. Absolutely. Now, 2 last things. I know we definitely want to jump in, and I apologize to you, for not really getting to spend a lot of time on the newest book, The Red Shepherd. But I really just wanted to dive into conversation in general, and that's what the listeners love. Before I do, one thing I wanted to ask you tonight, I don't want to not get my chance. A deity that I've worked with that has absolutely immense power, that I've only done a handful of times because of the power is a little awkward, Pazuzu. And I know Pazuzu is, obviously from the Mesopotamian pantheon and was the exponent or the enemy of Lamashtu, which was a vampiric spirit that killed children and mothers in childbirth, which is assimilated a lot of times to, once again, Lilith. How important... Folks nowadays are re-emerging that name. Pazuzu is becoming big again. People are worshiping Pazuzu, and it's becoming a focal point in occultism, especially the left-hand path. But how big, from your research, was Pazuzu in that time? Was it something that there was just this spirit that was little talked about, and nowadays it's got blown out of proportion? Or was Lord Pazuzu really that worshipped and revered back then?
Well, it's funny that you mention worshipped, because... he was, think of him as a big name, as kind of a notorious celebrity. While he wasn't worshipped, he was looked to for protection. So, say for instance, you're living in the inner city and you are approached by a shady individual who's like, hey, you pay me protection money, and I'll make sure that nothing happens to your business. In a spiritual sense, that is Pazuzu. While he is feared, while he is, a source of terror and dread, the enemy of your enemy is your friend in a way. So, and I actually have a space devoted to Pazuzu myself. He, lives at the top of my bookshelf with all of my spiritual texts. So yeah, I'm no stranger to his presence. And what's interesting is, in addition to his role as a protector of women in childbirth and as an enemy of Lamashtu, he's also petitioned to drive away other spirits, those spirits being the spirits that would afflict one with migraines and epilepsy. And those are 2 maladies that have plagued me since childhood. And it's wild because one of my most recent visits to my neurologist, prior to that visit, I was actually supposed to stay up for 24 hours. No sleep, no rest of any kind, just stay awake for 24 hours and, have all sorts of visual stimulation just to see if it would trigger anything in my brain. And during the course of all this, I also did a ritual to Pazuzu, and I carried a small effigy of him to my appointment and kept him in my pocket and didn't have any issues. So awesome. There's something to be said about these scary beings. And unfortunately, The Exorcist has painted him in a bad light.
Yes.
But suffice it to say, he is still a part of the spiritual zeitgeist that is the alternative left, that is, the spiritual current that defies the status quo. And, props where props are due. At least he's getting the attention that he deserves as a figure who evokes a sense of fear.
He does, and he's very powerful to work with. And it's funny because there's a girl that used to come to me. We're still friends on Facebook and everything. She'd come to me for advice with ritual workings, and she was just finding herself at that time. And I had mentioned she should work with Pazuzu. Well, this is about 4 years ago. Fast forward, she has an entire ritual or entire temple, to Pazuzu. I mean, her main practice is Pazuzu worship, and she's had exponential growth over the last 4 years working with him. So he's a very powerful spirit. As you said, it's a shame that pop culture just decides to pick a name that, because the iconography is scary. He's this dog-faced, lion-faced, big snake dick, lord that, that they're like, we're going to use him as the evil spirit that possesses this girl, when it makes no sense because he was a protector of children. So why would you make him the one possessing a child in a Hollywood movie? But, that's the type of stuff that they do in Hollywood. But I just definitely wanted to get your take on that. So, yeah, I mean, that led into so many more things because obviously they made amulets and, items of his iconography and name on them to help protect from Lamashtu, which eventually led to the demon catching bowls for Lilith and other spirit things. So as I said, it's always a trickle down effect where things lead to new ideas and new cultures, and that's why I was so excited to talk about Mesopotamia tonight, because as I feel, it literally was the waterfall that trickled into every stream and river and ocean since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
So I think that's very important, and that'll lead us into our last part here. Let's talk about The Red Shepherd. It's your brand new book. I haven't got a chance to read it yet, but I will. It looks like an amazing book. It brings to light Dumuzid, who was very misunderstood, not known about in most circles. Tell us a little bit about the inspiration to write this book. I think you said that it kind of stemmed from LIONESS because there was mention of him, and obviously he was the consort of her at one point. Tell us, your inspiration to make this book and really what someone can expect when reading it.
Yeah, sure. One thing that I do want to touch on, I was scrolling through my phone while we were chatting about Pazuzu. If anyone is interested in historical data, historical texts, and material that expounds upon the source material, there is an academic by the name of Nils Hiesel who has written extensively about Pazuzu. So the spelling of his first name is N as in November, ILS as in Sierra, and then the spelling of his last name is HEES as in Sierra, EL. And again, he's written extensively about Pazuzu. So if you're interested, definitely check him out. His papers are actually free to download from academia.edu. So anyway, back to your question.
I appreciate that.
You're welcome. The Red Shepherd it's a funny book because there's a lot of material that I wrote that I wanted to include in Rod and Ring, and a lot of it had to do with the figure of Dumuzid, who I was introduced to decades ago in the book of Ezekiel, where the women were mourning for Tammuz in the temple square. And I realized after reading the material, there's no way that this material is going to make sense in the grand scope of Rod and Ring. And I sat on it and I, read over it at times and used the material in the book for ritual. And I decided, you know what? This needs to be fleshed out some more. So I fleshed it out, pitched it to Anathema, and, we went back and forth on the development of it. And, I had all of these titles originally, like the Sumerian Christ, just these buzz titles that would really get people talking, or, people blowing up my inbox or my DMs telling me that, I was going about it all wrong. I do highlight the erroneous conclusions that were made by academics like Alexander Hislop, who was a Free Scottish minister in the 1800s, who proposed this crazy idea that has ironically been picked up by neo-pagans, that Rome was the originator of the cult of the mother and the child, and Tammuz or Dumuzid was the original child and, went on to, denigrate and bash Catholics and pagans the world over. But his information, of course, his thesis has since been discredited. But there was another academic whose work that I read, Hugo Radow. His work has also been debunked. But he wrote something that really struck a chord in me, and it was this notion, and of course, early academia in the 19th century was informed by biblical archaeology. It was this idea that the Bible was the source of truth, and in order to substantiate that truth, we have to dig up the Middle East. So he proposed in one of his works that the identity of Dumuzid was actually the Sumerians reaching in the dark for the figure of Christ who was realized in this figure. And I read that and I thought, this is the craziest shit that I have. Crazy. But it resonated with me, and it was like whispering in the ear of my younger self, and hey, check this out. And while again it's been debunked, in the spirit of things, I was like, this is so cool. So not only did I take the ritual that I had written, the pre-existing ritual, I expounded upon that ritual, and I also went through all of his relevant myths, wrote adaptations of those myths that are callbacks to the source material. So with the exception of one composition, all of those myths are consistent with historical source material. I did write a composition that addresses his obscure paternity, because within the course of mythology, he's got several different fathers. His name is translated to be the good son. And it is widely accepted that his father is Enki, or Yah, to the Akkadian-speaking Mesopotamians. What's interesting about Enki's name is, over time, his name has become translated to be Lord Earth. But prior to that iteration of his name, in the distant past, the rendering of his name, if we were to spell it, would be E-N-K-I-A-G, K-I-A-G being Kyang, which means beloved. So he was the beloved Lord, and his son was the good son. So these crazy iterations there. But in my research, not only is he the consort of Inanna, and the unfortunate victim of her rage, that's his most notable myth, and unfortunately he is depicted in that myth as being rather helpless. What's interesting is his original myths predated Inanna's, and if we look at other myths in which he is featured in other liturgical compositions, he is like the ladies' man. He is the Lothario. I mean, he's got some BDE, big Dumuzid energy. And not only that, he's also a warrior. He's described as a warrior who dances in the heat of battle. He is a king. He is a dignitary. He has these priestly and kingly titles. He also, in later myths and in later iterations and conceptions of his divinity, he also has a place in heaven. He possesses a throne upon the earth, and he possesses a seat of power in the underworld. And in one composition, he is actually mentioned as second to Ereshkigal. So whereas Inanna, as a big G, big god, has all of these various domains that are under her purview, Dumuzid also has domains under his purview that are very complementary to Inanna's. So he is a god in heaven, earth, and the underworld. She is a goddess of heaven, earth, and the underworld. And, later in antiquity, especially in the Old Babylonian period, he becomes a god of exorcists. He becomes a psychopomp. He becomes a god who relieves his supplicants of illness and disease. Where else do we see that in the ancient Near East? You know, we have a figure who is called the Good Son. We have a figure who dies and rises again. We have a figure that heals the sick, who, you know, leads ghosts in his train from the underworld into the heavens. And that isn't to say that Dumuzid is Christ, but there is that
parallel
thread, that parallel that's woven there. And, you know, there's a thought experiment that I play upon that in the book, but the material is harmonious with the source material. So we have these myths, we have liturgy, which in addition to English translations, I've also included the transliterations of Sumerian texts. So not only is the prospective reader going to be reciting liturgy, they're also going to be reciting Sumerian language, at least as we comprehend it. Unfortunately, the original cuneiform is difficult to format. So that, of course, is not included, because while I have the extension on my phone and my computer, you know, it's not something that publishers can just readily get access to and have it formatted for PDFs and publication. It's got to be broken down in various ways. So sorry to the people who expect actual cuneiform. I apologize. Maybe in the future, when the world is perfect, we can make that happen. But we've got myth, we have liturgy, and then there's ritual. So we go into ritual wherein the supplicant can approach Dumuzid to exorcise a ghost or spirit or a demon. There's also a ritual in which a malevolent figure who is controlled by Dumuzid and also his brother-in-law Utu or Shamash and his father-in-law Nana or Sin, their petition to release this malevolent figure to oppose the persecutor of the supplicant. So if anyone's interested in some malefic left-hand path material within the Mesopotamian milieu, I'm sure they'll appreciate it. There it is. There's also a, and this is going to make some people uncomfortable, because apparently LIONESS ruffled some feathers, some Victorian sensibilities because of the sexuality in it. But there is a sex rite in it, which is consistent with the source material, so hold on to your hats with that one. But in addition to these, I also go into detail about the creation of the cult image of not just Dumuzid, but this is a ritual. It's a detailed ritual, but it's one that can be used to vivify any cult image. So if somebody in the left-hand path chooses to use the source material to awaken their icon of Lilith or Belial, or, you know, whatever spirit or deity or, you know, intelligence you work with or devoted to, the same material can be used for that purpose. And I also go into brief background about the god and elaborate on why it's important to focus on deities like him who are otherwise overlooked, because he is just as approachable as any other deity. So I go into detail about his various epithets, the cultures or the cults, as well as the cities that were devoted to him. What's interesting, and I do want to point this out to those who are interested in the god Nergal, both Dumuzid and Nergal share a lot of epithets. So in reading many of these texts, you don't know at times if you're reading about Nergal or if you're reading about Dumuzid, because both of them are described as being the Lord of the Underworld or the Bull of the Underworld. So it's interesting that we've got these parallels there.
No, that is very interesting. And I mean, as you were saying that, and one thing I already kind of knew was so if we step out of bounds, you have, Nergal and you have Dumuzid, as you said, sharing a lot of things in common, and then also Dumuzid sharing a lot of things in common with later generation of Jesus Christ. But then you also see that parallel of Hecate, being Psychopomp, lord of the Empyrean realms, the Chthonic realms, and the Telluric earth realm. Having hounds, whereas Dumuzid has been said to have hounds, as you had talked about before and elucidated on. It's very interesting when you see those different names, different cultures, different pantheons, but yet they share such similar iconography or background. I'm a big exponent of Hecatian work. Actually, half of my practice is, as you said, your temple's right beside you, mine as well. You can't see it over here, but I have a 200-some square foot temple over here, and half of that is specifically to Hecate. So
that's awesome.
It's very interesting. I know whenever I heard you talk about that with Alexander from Glitch Bottle Podcast, shout out to Alexander. Great show, folks. If you haven't ever checked out Glitch Bottle, please do. He wrote the foreword or the preface for the book, I believe, correct?
Yes, he did.
Awesome. Yeah, I heard you talking to him about the kind of the parallels and similarities there between Hecate, and I thought that was awesome to hear, because I didn't know much about Dumuzid until then. So it was a great thing to learn about and see those parallels there that travel amongst, how many years apart, still being there with other cultures. Well, folks, if you're looking for it, Anathema Publishing, you can find The Rod and the Ring, and you can also find The Red Shepherd. As I said, on Miskatonic Books, you can find LIONESS if you're looking for it right now through Grail Publishing. Other than that, Samuel, I do obviously want to thank you for coming onto the show, going over such great detail of so many things. It's truly been an honor of mine to have you here and to pick your brain. Great topics and conversation this evening.
Yeah, likewise, Frater. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Last thing I guess I would ask is, or have you tell, is where folks can check you out at and any other news you think that they should know about.
Sure. So I'm on Instagram. Was on TikTok, of course, but, bailed on that. Instagram, Threads, Facebook, at Rod and Ring, so it's pretty consistent there. If you want to blow up my inbox, it's rodandring@gmail.com. At least if you're going to throw some heat at me, at least put a smiley face in in the body of the message. And just keep your eyes peeled, because there's other projects down the pike, and who knows, maybe there's going to be another book released in 2 more years. I'm trying to be consistent here, and live up to my childhood dreams of being a published author, and get my name out in the world.
Well, you've done quite well, brother, and I appreciate everything you're doing for the community and for the knowledge that you're putting out there for people to practice and to learn. It's important that, people have access to this type of material and to be able to learn accurately and powerfully, because as you said, you come from an academic standpoint of research. You might mix in personal experience, but I think that is always needed in any type of practice, and you're bringing not just personal experience, you're bringing the mixture of UPG, as people call it, and academic source material together, and the two of those together are the perfect flow to make very powerful working. So, folks, if you're listening out there, check out his books, support everything this man is doing. It's very powerful. If you're looking for a path that might suit you, this just might be it. So check it out. Other than that, 2 weeks from now, let me give you guys a date real quick. I had it up and I think I closed it. The 21st, we have... My damn phone closed the program. 21st, we have the next episode of Knights of the Nephilim, and we are bringing on an author of Luciferian stature. I'm looking for his thing here. That is Richard K. Page. He has about 8 or 9 books, I think, all about Luciferianism. So we're going to be talking about, that topic and going into depth with that. And then I have a special episode a couple weeks later of Ophis Christos, who is an author with some very powerful workings. He wrote a book called The Black Book of Kimbanda. He wrote the book Anima Satani, Traditional Satanism, and some other works that are very, very dark and not for everybody, but I'm looking forward to it. These guys don't do interviews, so he's not going to be on the show. He will only do a written interview. I will somehow find a way to read both both sides of it, and we'll figure it out. I don't know yet because they don't speak English, for one, and two, they never show themselves or let their voices be heard. They are very mysterious, so we'll figure out a way to do that. So make sure you check out those next 2 upcoming episodes. And then last announcement here, next week, the 14th of September, as I said, we are kicking off with Russian sleep experiments and diving deep into that subject matter on Season 4, Episode 1 premiere of the Celestial Oddities Paranormal Guys podcast with me and my co-host Daniel James, so make sure you check that out. Other than that, click the like, share, and follow button. I will throw up on the page real quick. If you like the show and you're a supporter of the show, there's a QR code there. It's called Buy Me a Coffee, because your support gets me week to week through the show, and your coffee gets me day to day through my life. So feel free to take that QR code, donate a couple bucks if you like the show. It really helps and goes a long way. And other than that, love you guys. Thank you so much for everything you do for the show. Samuel, once again, thank you for coming on, brother. It's been an honor.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, guys. We will catch you next time here on Knights of the Nephilim.